In 1920, a bright young engineer put Las Cruces, New Mexico on the map and on the air. That year, Ralph Willis Goddard, an electrical engineering professor and department head at New Mexico College of Agriculture and Mechanic Arts, broadcast the first signals from his hand-built radio station in a small shack on the college campus. It was one of the first radio broadcasts west of the Mississippi River and the first ever in New Mexico. That small radio station would come to be known as KOB, one of the most powerful in the country. 100 years later, we look at the man whose remarkable life and tragic death was tied to one of the most significant technologies of the 20th century.
100 years ago, in the Mesilla Valley, it was a very different community. It was very small. There was several miles between State College and downtown, which was filled with desert, wasn't filled with the homes that we have now. Not a lot of homes had electricity. Not a lot of homes had running water.
It was a very different geography at that time. Las Cruces was one town, Mesilla Park was another town, Old Mesilla was another town, and State College was a town of its own. Dean Goddard had to ride a horse to go to work. He did that for 2 years. And when the family needed groceries, well, they piled into a buckboard and the same horse took them to Las Cruces to buy supplies. It was a day's chore.
Not a lot of automobiles 100 years ago here. So there was still horse and buggy and a lot of bicycles. Before cars became popular, bicycles were very popular all over the country, but especially here in Las Cruces in New Mexico. Railroads had electricity and some of the businesses had electricity. So there was some telephone communication. Usually you only had to dial 3, 4 numbers to get the party that you wanted to, or you'd go through a switchboard operator. And of course there was telegraph, but that was through wires. Telegraph, telephone, all through wires. So this wireless technology was something that was pretty new in the early part of the 20th century when Goddard first came to State College.
Ralph Willis Goddard was an extraordinary young man. When he grew up, he had gas lights in his neighborhood and also in his house. But he electrified his house. He put in electric lights, and he actually built a power station at the back of the house.
Ralph W. Goddard was born in 1887 in Massachusetts and grew up there and then went to the Worcester Polytechnic Institute, graduated from there in 1911.
He was a little entrepreneur. He did bicycle repair and electrical appliance repair. He was very good at teaching himself. He had learned almost everything he knew from personal study and experimentation, observation. He had a little model train with a track that went all the way around his workshop. That was where he got his first publicity. I think he was 16 or 17. He got a canoe when he was still in high school and he put an outboard motor on it, so it was a motorboat after that. But he eventually bought a yacht, which he rented out for charter cruises, so he was making money for his college education in various ways.
Perhaps Ralph Goddard was first introduced to wireless communication when he sailed off of the East Coast, when he was still back in Massachusetts at the Worcester Polytechnic Institute. And I think perhaps that's when he first got interested in wireless communication.
Ralph Goddard had a girlfriend, Frances Gascoigne. He called her Frankie. She liked to ride on the motorcycle with him, and so he invented the motorcycle sidecar, and that was their transportation. It looked like an armchair. Frankie was not a motorcycle mama. She sat there with her bonnet and her dress on in the chair, and it looked very comfortable. He created a company called the R.W. Goddard Company, Ralph Goddard Treasurer. He didn't make himself president. But that was another part of his entrepreneurship. He had a mail order business to sell some of his products. He did invent the motorcycle stand that supported the rear wheel, sold it for $1. He was just a very clever fellow. His parents had an interesting relationship. His mother was more of an elite, I guess, very proud of the Goddard name, which was an important name in New England. She was very fussy about him dressing correctly, speaking correctly. She made him take music lessons. He played the cornet. I think he really liked playing the cornet because he continued that even when he was here in New Mexico. He and his wife had family concerts. So he was a sort of a Renaissance man. He wasn't just a Dilbert. He graduated from Worcester Polytechnic in 1911. I should mention, though, he was valedictorian of his 9th grade class, and he wrote his valedictorian speech on wireless telegraphy. So he had already developed an interest in radio at that 9th grade level. Then when he went to Worcester Polytech, he earned his way there with all his repairs, and he wrote magazine articles. He graduated there in 1911. His thesis was titled "The Construction and Test of a Windmill Electric Lighting Plant." So he had been interested in wind energy as early as 1911. And in fact, he had built a windmill on the top of one of Worcester's buildings. So that was the first time he had put stuff on a university roof.
The same year that Goddard graduated from the Worcester Polytechnic Institute, he married Frances Gascoigne in 1911. And eventually they had 4 sons, both in Nebraska and then here in the Mesilla Valley. And so in the 1920s, 1920s, they raised their sons here.
Her father was a builder in Boston, and he was very impressed with Ralph. I think he was delighted that they got married. But right after Ralph graduated from Worcester Polytechnic, Mr. Gascoigne offered him a job as a construction estimator with his building company in Boston. And Ralph took it, but it was a big diversion from what he really wanted to do. The upside is that he learned a lot about construction, which had served him very well later on, particularly building the buildings for the radio station here on campus. But he wasn't very happy as a building estimator, and so he started sending out his application to universities. Got hired by the University of Nebraska first as an instructor, which got his feet wet. He did like teaching, liked it very much. But Frankie did not like all that corn. She said there's all this flat land and all that corn. She was not happy in Nebraska. Ralph and Frankie and their baby Kenneth were taking a vacation at a beach in Nebraska, and Frankie noticed a fellow on a bicycle trying to make his way along the shoreline, and she was complaining about what a silly thing for him to be out there with a bicycle. But he came close enough to talk to them, and he said, "Are you Ralph Goddard?" And he said he was, and so he says, "Well, I have a telegram for you." Well, they were very concerned that it might be family problems or something, but when Ralph opened it, it was a telegram from New Mexico College of Agricultural and Mechanic Arts. Ralph said, "Oh, they're offering me a job as head of the electrical division," which was a step up from what he was doing in Nebraska. So Frankie was quite interested then. She wanted to get away from Nebraska with all its flat land and all the corn. So she said, "Let's take it, Ralph." Well, he had already signed a contract with Nebraska, but he just made such a good impression with people that Nebraska forgave him. They said, "Go ahead and take it. This is a step up, and if it doesn't work out, we'll have a place for you to come back." So took away the risk, and they agreed to go to New Mexico and start in the fall semester.
Ralph Goddard and his young family moved to New Mexico, and he began his new job as professor and head of the Electrical Engineering Division at New Mexico College of Agriculture and Mechanic Arts in Las Cruces. He took an office in the newly constructed Campus Engineering Building, which would years later be named Goddard Hall in his honor. In 1919, Goddard organized the Campus Radio Club. In June of 1920, he was named Dean of Engineering and was granted experimental radio license 5XD. Goddard and the radio club made modifications and upgrades to their equipment, and on April 5, 1922, Goddard's radio station was issued government license KOB, and they began broadcasting to the public.
They had to come to New Mexico on the train, which was an eye-opener for them. They came in through Raton Pass and then over to the western side of the state and down along the river. Ralph was impressed with the isolation of all the population. They'd go miles without seeing a house or a store or a primitive road, and he thought, how do these people know what's going on? What happens if they have bad weather coming or something? So the idea took birth right then that they needed a way to communicate with each other. And he thought about how useful radio had been to the sailors in the coast. He thought perhaps he could do something to bridge the distance between all the people in New Mexico who were separated from news and help.
So Ralph Goddard got to southern New Mexico in 1914. And so he came here, started teaching engineering, electrical engineering, early on in the 20th century. What changed was the punitive expedition against Pancho Villa in 1916, and then the United States getting into World War I a year after that. And because of his interest in wireless communication, which was such essential for military. He helped first with training cadets at State College to work the wireless in their signal corps, both in the United States and in Mexico during the punitive expedition, and then with the American Expeditionary Force supporting the Allies in World War I.
He got a car in 1916. It was a 1914 car. First thing he did was to get a piece of paper and figure out how to make a trailer to take behind it so they could go camping. And he designed one that folded up on the sides, or the sides folded up and then they folded out to make beds. And he had a tent that covered the top of it. So it was very much like something you could buy today, I guess, a travel trailer. When the war was over, amateur radio's ban was lifted, so Goddard was kind of interested in explaining that to his students. He had a different type of student too. When he first came to Cruces, well, he had farm boys in their overalls and bare feet. Now the people coming back from the war were older men who'd been in war. They were very serious-minded. They'd seen what communications could do, so he didn't have a hard sell to interest them in forming a radio club. The Signal Corps was the source of some materials too. He salvaged a whole building to make use of as a radio shack, and he had several bits of equipment left from them as a starting point for what they wanted to build. So he got the guys involved and started the club. The first problem, I think, was the geography of the state. They had to deal with those mountains, so they needed a great deal of height to overcome the limitations that they presented. So Goddard Hall was a good place to start. It was 60 feet tall. So Goddard got a 60-foot mast, and a very brave student who helped get it up on top of the dome. So we had 120 feet of mast to support their aerials. That lasted about a month before the wind blew it down, and it fell in 3 pieces through the roof of the engineering building. So that was the first mark that they left on that building.
So Goddard received a government license for his radio station in 1920, KOB. Growing up in Albuquerque in the 60s and 70s, KOB was the voice of the Great Southwest. And so KOB has been around a long time. He broadcast Aggie football games live right around the early 1920s. The first football game he broadcast was between the Aggies and the Albuquerque Indian School, and the score was something like 56-0, go Aggies. So he would broadcast that. Also, he would broadcast live music. He would take a microphone into the music hall and would broadcast live there. And crop reports, things like that, some things that people, not just in Las Cruces, but in the region would want to know about, how much corn would go for, what roads were closed because of weather or construction or things like that. And remember, cars were just coming in. So roads weren't very good, even between here and El Paso. It took about 3 hours to drive if you had a car. So road conditions were very important to hear what roads were good that day.
I can't remember what year that was, but what they did was to build the new building around the old radio shack and then take the radio shack out piece by piece through the door, which I thought was also some interesting construction strategy. Dean Goddard had a student named Robert Stewart, who was one of the younger members of the class, but he was very devoted to the dean. And he got called upon often to do some very tricky work, like climbing up to the top of the 60-foot mast, which was at the top of a 60-foot building, to attach the guy wires. I think Stewart got to be quite comfortable up at the top of the roost. He was up there a lot repairing wind destruction.
Goddard was a pioneer in teaching electrical engineering. He came here, of course, from Massachusetts and then by way of Nebraska, and he then was very active in teaching students here. And this is a land-grant college, so it's a college that focuses on agriculture, of course, but also focuses on engineering. Those are some of the main strengths of a land-grant college. So when he came here, he was welcomed into the engineering college and particularly in electrical engineering, which was pretty new to this part of the country.
Ralph Goddard gave us a vision. He really set the DNA of the College of NMSU along the lines of being student-focused, making sure that students learn, and more than that, making sure that the students are taken care of academically and non-academically. In fact, back then, the instructors used to invite the students to their homes for dinner and maybe give even loans to these students.
He was a mentor to his students, a lifelong friend to them. He was a builder, a community leader. He broke ground for the Las Cruces High School and supervised its quality control and its construction, and it's still standing, still serving, so very fine, sturdy building.
Goddard had a passion for radio, and that's going to translate. A good instructor a good professor will include that enthusiasm into his teaching, and students will be enthusiastic about it as well. And some of the more perceptive students will say, aha, this is a wave of the future. I can see this is something that not only will interest them, something that they can get jobs in the future. That's still today here at New Mexico State University. Students come in here and go, oh, that's what I want to do. Not just because I feel passionate about it, but also because I can get jobs at that. And so he fueled that passion for this new technology, this radio wireless technology.
Everybody just loved him. He was a wonderful father and financier. The students never had enough money to pay their room and board bill, and so Dean Goddard would find work for them, if not at the station, at his home, for them to earn the 25 cents a day it took to pay the bill. So.
He used to compete with the College of Agriculture back then to increase the number of students, and he used to go around the state to recruit the students to NMSU College of Engineering. And he was so instrumental in making the program offerings formal that several deans after him do credit him for the accreditation success of all the engineering programs that we now offer at NMSU.
Well, Dean Goddard tragically died on December 31st, 1929. KOB was going to broadcast live that night to ring in the new year of a new decade. Dean Goddard went down to the radio antenna to power it up.
On New Year's Eve, Dean Goddard died in the KOB station he had constructed. He was accidentally electrocuted by some of the equipment in the transmitter room while making last-minute preparations for a special program scheduled to be aired that night. Harold Elmendorf and his wife, Sarah, of Las Cruces, were friends of Dean and Mrs. Goddard. On that New Year's Eve night, they and other friends were expecting to have dinner and play bridge later with the Dean and his wife. Would you please tell us about that night?
Well, that night was a pretty horrible experience. Mr. Goddard had sent word that he would be a little late, and they could go ahead and have the dinner, which we were supposed to be. And we waited for some time, and still no results. And finally somebody either went from the party to see what was keeping him, or somebody from the college told, I don't know just which it was. But anyway, at that time, we found that he had been found laying on the floor right below some big switches, electrical switches, which he had evidently been working with for some reason. And he was then just dead on the floor.
I just saw what was the end of it. I busted my little focus and got down there pretty fast, and I got home, ran in the kitchen, told my mother that something had happened, and Dr. Kent drove up just about that time. And they were doing their darndest but there was nothing that could be done. I mean, it was over before it started even. Yeah. He was out literally cooked.
The doctors intimated his death resulted from his blood being boiled by the shock and then congealing, after which he just had no chance to live. The imprint of his feet was burned into the concrete floor. The station was silent until January 2nd, 1930, when Harry Kent announced the death of KOB's founder to the studio audience.
As a consequence of Dean Goddard's sudden and tragic death, as a consequence of all of a sudden this vacuum of leadership for this flagship station of KOB, interest in the radio station dwindled at State College. And so in 1932, it was sold to an Albuquerque company, an Albuquerque firm, and KOB was moved up to Albuquerque, where it continues to be a voice of the Great Southwest, KKOB, both AM and FM. It was a real tragedy for the community, for the university, for the region, to lose this, to have this voice go silent.
It was dormant for a few years. They had offers from various places to buy it, but there were always some objections to the deal. I think the Albuquerque Journal had the most attractive offer, and they were very good to the campus. They paid all the expenses to move the station to Albuquerque, and they paid, I don't remember what kind of remuneration, but they made it a very agreeable deal to take over the management of KOB.
Had he not died at such a young age of 42, Ralph Goddard would have enjoyed the evolving activities in the television invention and in the dynamic activities surrounding space studies in New Mexico. The areas such as White Sands and the evolving periods that led to Manhattan Project, the physical science laboratory establishment at New Mexico State University, would have made Ralph Goddard feel like a kid in a candy store.
And I do regret that he didn't live a full lifespan. I could have overlapped with him and possibly had a chance to meet him. This picture came to me out of the blue in 1996. It was in my mailbox, a gift from Bob Stewart, the man who had been such a helpful source when I wrote the book. He was in his 90s, I believe, when he sent this, but this picture was of him sportcasting from Aggie Stadium with his date, Billy Yost from Mesilla Park. He said that she was the May Queen that year. So that was like having a letter sweater, I guess. It was so sweet of him, though. I'm so happy to have this picture, a last communication from Bob.
Goddard's legacy lives on at New Mexico State University. The engineering building where he broadcast New Mexico's first radio signals was dedicated in 1934 as Goddard Hall. The stately structure still serves as the administrative center for the College of Engineering. KRWG Public Media, also on the campus of NMSU, honors Ralph Willis Goddard's legacy in the call letters of KRWG FM radio and KRWG TV. The radio station that Goddard founded is still on the air in Albuquerque, now known as KKOB.
I feel like Dean Goddard was a gift to our state, a gift to our university, a gift to the world. I think he accomplished as much in a lifetime that was half as long as mine as I could ever hope to. He was just a fabulously productive and focused person, and I'm so glad that his memory is being revived. He's been forgotten twice, so thank you so much for doing this story.